Welcome back. So now what I'm going to talk about is just some issues that we have whenever we're trying to figure out minority mental health. I've already talked about it, but I'm going to talk more specifically about it. This lecture won't be as long as the first one, but I wanted to separate it because I wanted to just give you a break. So the main issues that we see, and I'm going to break these down, and once I break these down, that'll be it for this lecture. So we have data quality issues and then the social context of minority mental health. So those are the two major overarching issues in understanding minority mental health and drawing major patterns. So when it comes to collecting quality data, well, one, we just have a hard part getting information. Like coverage of the population is literally just a fancy way of saying that like we have a hard time talking to people. We just can't get all the data. And so there's low response rates of some group. So Black men, for example, are less likely to respond to surveys. So this is because partially because there's a stigma linked to talking about emotions for Black men. Also due to, maybe lower SES or having to, or lower SES leading you to be able to, or having to work more. Maybe there's also not just as much free time to take surveys, for example. And so some groups just don't respond as much. And if you don't get the responses, then you can't really collect or, make patterns. Heterogeneity. So subgroups vary across a broad range of socio-demographic characteristics. So again, I mentioned that Arab Americans are listed as white. But if I just say, white mental health, and then I go into a whole spiel about Arab American mental health, a lot of you would be like, which one are you talking about? According to the census, it's all the same thing. But if you were to ask most Arab Americans, I can't say that. I would say the Arab Americans I've spoken with and from what I've read, they don't consider themselves white. They don't think they're really treated as white. And so we also know very little about, for example, mental health of recent African immigrants. But in America, we would say recent African immigrants, well, they're Black. Lump them in with the Blacks. But the mental health of recent African immigrants is going to be very different because migration and acculturation is a huge part of mental health as well. And so we don't know enough about that group, but we lump them in with Black people, even though they have different experiences than, diasporic Blacks. Intersectionality. I'm not going to do a whole thing about this because we'll talk about it in a little bit. But again, intersectionality, the idea that we have different identities. When I say heterogeneity, we're different. We're not just one group. So it's not that we're all the same just because, I'm Black, I'm the same as every other Black person. No, I'm a Black queer neurodivergent woman, and that's going to be different than somebody who is a straight neurotypical Black person. We also have missing data of small groups. So groups that are small, rare, or widely dispersed, it's just difficult to talk to them. We have the issue of measuring mental health. So first off, we can't even get people to talk. We can't find them. Which, think about, again, the early studies on Black health. What did we find? All the early studies on Black health found that Black people had issues. Darn them slaves for wanting to run away. They must be sick in the head. It makes sense why groups who have historically been regarded as inferior are not, racing to do more tests. Because historically, all of those tests have eventually said they're not as good. So why would these people go out of their way to fill out these scales when history says all it does is work against them? So we have an issue even talking to people or finding people. Then the measures that we use to measure mental health are also troublesome. And so the scales that we use might not capture rates of disorder. So self-reporting, allowing people to self-report, skews data. So if you're taking a test or a scale or a survey and you rate yourself as depressed because your dog passed away last night, yeah, you're having an episode of depression, but you're not probably chronically depressed. On the other end, you have people who have all the symptoms. You haven't gotten out of bed. You barely have an appetite. You're not answering your phone. You have no joy. You have no hope for anything. And you just feel empty inside. But no, I don't have depression. I'm just tired. Self-reporting is tough because you have people basically diagnosing themselves. And that's not, remember the word reliable, that's not going to give us reliable results. Self-selecting skews data. And so you might have, think about whenever you see, surveys on campus, surveys that offer money on campus. People who need money might be more likely to do these surveys. And so you might get an overrepresentation of poor people. Or you might get an overrepresentation of people who just happen to see that flyer first because their class ended right before or right after the flyer or right before the flyer got posted on the board. And so self-reporting has issues, self-selecting has issues, especially because the people who we need to know about their mental health might be the most resistant people to talking about their mental health. So they don't talk about it. And then we don't hear from them, but they're the ones who we need to talk to. And then we have racial differences in symptoms and disorders. And so Black people tend to have higher levels of symptoms, but equivalent or lower rates of disorder. And so we might find that Black people feel less hopeful about their future overall. They might feel less connected to their environment. They might not have as much joy in their day-to-day lives, but they'd be less likely to report themselves as being depressed. And so this is tough because we might see equal rates of, disorder or similar rates of disorder, but totally different rates of symptoms and vice versa. And we actually find the same finding about higher level of symptoms, but, lower rates of disorder. We find that with Puerto Ricans and Chinese Americans as well. And then language barriers. I mean, that's what it sounds like. If you have a language barrier, you might have a hard time understanding the questions on the survey. If there's a language barrier, the researcher might have a hard time understanding your response. So it might be hard to measure mental health of somebody, or especially of a recent immigrant, if they don't speak the language. And that's a real thing. I mean, it's worth mentioning because that is a real barrier that hasn't been addressed sufficiently. Culture. The inattention to the role of culture contributes to the systematic patterns of misdiagnosis across racial groups. So some specific symptoms related to disorders vary across cultural groups. So if we think about the Inuits, Inuits by culture, culturally, have been socialized away from displaying anger. So because of that, they have a lower threshold for expression of anger, expression of this emotion to qualify as a symptom of mental illness. And so it's important to understand how Inuits express anger, because the way that they express anger, if we're thinking about what's deviant and what's not deviant, well, they're socialized differently. And so for example, my idea of being just a little irritated, how I might express irritation could come off as me being furious or irate if I am in an Inuit home. Versus if an Inuit is in my home and they're really, really mad and they think that they're showing me they're mad, I might not be able to tell because I have a higher threshold for that. And so some symptoms that we relate to disorders can vary across cultures, and that can make it difficult because every culture has different thresholds for what's considered deviant. Cultural beliefs and DSM symptoms may overlap. So we think about Spiritism in Puerto Rican culture. Spiritist belief, that the spirits are telling you to do good things or bad things. There's a split between your mind and your body. You're hearing voices. And so all of these mind-body split, that could be considered dissociation, being told to do good or bad things by spirits, hearing voices. According to the DSM, that's psychosis. But don't you dare tell somebody who is a spiritist that, because that is their culture. That is a spiritist belief. That is a religious belief. And so that's difficult as well, because you might have somebody reporting, yeah, I hear voices all the time. And an American researcher might say, well, they're experiencing psychosis, but to them and their family and their community, they're perfectly healthy. I mean, think about it. I mentioned this before, Sojourner Truth, she was hit in the head with a paperweight and she began to have hallucinations that told her how to free the enslaved people. And I'm so fortunate, not that she was hit in the head, but I'm fortunate that she trusted her hallucinations and didn't say, well, this is in the DSM, I better not free anybody. She didn't think about the DSM and she trusted her hallucinations. Whereas today, we might not trust our hallucinations if you have the same kind of calling to you, because you are already socialized into thinking that hearing voices makes you quote unquote crazy. But depending on your culture and the time, that might be what your society needs, honestly. And then the historical precedent of misdiagnosing Black Americans. So I said this already. And so we find that regardless of the race of the practitioner, So regardless of whether the psychiatrist is Black or white or what race they are, psychiatrists are more likely to ascribe violence, suspiciousness, and dangerousness to Black men. So one study had psychiatrists look at case files of Black patients and white patients. It was the same, this is called an audit study. This was the same case file, just different race, different picture. And the psychiatrists, no matter what their race were more likely to say that the Black case file was more violent and suspicious. And again, this was done like as an experiment. So like they didn't realize, what was going on here. If you want the study, it's in your reading, but if you want me to like help you find it or something, if you can't find it in the references, let me know. It's actually really interesting. But same case file, but just knowing that one's Black and one's white, oh, the Black one's the aggressive one, but it was the same case file. Psychiatrists are more likely to label Blacks as having psychopathology, and they're also less likely to give severe diagnoses to white patients in relation. And so remember, the diagnosis you get, whether you're labeled as deviant or not, that really relies upon your status characteristic. Remember that labeling diagram I showed you. And if you don't remember, I recommend you go back and look at it because you'll be tested on it. I love that diagram. I stand by that diagram. So this is me telling you the labeling and deviance diagram. I love it. It's going to be on the exam. There you go. But if you think about it, or you remember it, it's deviance happens. I'm plugging my laptop. Deviance happens. And we all commit acts of deviance. All of us do. But only some of us are labeled as deviant. And so I mentioned before, there are, white children and Black children, and all children are annoying, honestly. But what we'll find is that the white child will act out and will be given the benefit of the doubt of he's just having a bad day. Whereas the Black kid is diagnosed with ADHD and then given 30 milligrams of Adderall to take every single day at the age of 7. I didn't make that up. I know someone who that happened to. So there's also the history of, misdiagnosing Black Americans. So then we have the social context of minority mental health. So one of the strongest determinants of variations in health status is socioeconomic status. So the lower SES you have, the higher your exposure to risk, the higher your risk of being alienated, and the higher your perceived level of powerlessness is, all of which influence, your negative health in a negative way. Excuse me. And so there are well-established patterns of variations in mental health by SES. You should know this, I just talked about this yesterday. So race is strongly associated with SES. Native Americans, Latinx folk, Blacks, some Asian Pacific Islanders have lower SES than white Americans. Again, as I mentioned a few slides ago, not all of it. Like I said, whenever I talk about crazy rich Asians, you're probably imagining a very specific stereotype of Asian. Whereas you can probably also push yourself to think about Asian groups who do not fit that. And so I want to point out, and you shouldn't be too surprised by this, that these differences are social. It's not that, white people are just smart and hard workers and Black people are lazy and weak. It's not that. This is a social difference. And so socioeconomic differences reflect the impact of economic discrimination produced by large-scale societal structures. One moment, please. But socioeconomic similarities do not equal equality. So even if we do find that, Japanese American immigrants have similar wealth to white Americans, that doesn't mean that there's equality. Having the same income or wealth does not mean you are equal, as we talked about a little bit yesterday. If we then control for SES, so if I'm saying, oh, there's a big thing with class here, but even if we control for class, that only partially reduces differences in mental health. There's still more, it's not straightforward. And so we do see that low SES Blacks have higher rates of psychological distress than low SES whites. We see that low SES Black women have higher rates of alcohol and drug abuse than low SES white women. And this is also interesting because we think of, Remember, we talked about gender. There's internalizing and externalizing disorders. And women are primarily, exhibitors of internalizing behaviors, whereas substance abuse tends to be more associated with men and externalizing, display of distress. However, when it comes to race, gender, and class, we find that Black women actually tend to exhibit externalizing behaviors. So, and we'll talk about that actually more next week as well. And then we find that when it comes to disorder, race, gender, and class, that low SES Black men have lower rates of psychiatric disorder than low SES white men. And so whenever we control for class, you might think if we just take class away, that'll fix everything. But in reality, something's going on here with race. Discrimination has a negative impact on mental health, and we'll talk about that in a second. And so we also have a non-equivalence of SES measures. There are racial differences in the quality of education, income returns for a given occupation, wealth gaps, purchasing power, stability of employment, and health risk associated with occupational hazards. Like I just mentioned, racism itself has an impact on mental health. So even if we take away class differences, there's something going on with racism. Same thing with sexism, ableism, neurotypicalism, cissexism. Living under an ism is going to take a toll on you, whether it is blatant slurs and hate crimes, or whether it's microaggressions, or whether it's both. If you are the victim of a schism, of any ism, it takes a toll on you. It doesn't mean that if you're not the victim of an ism that you don't have bad mental health, but isms, they negatively impact your mental health. And so when I talk about what level of society that racism occurs on, yes, it's the individual level, but it's also the macro level. It's about inequalities, both local and higher level. And so prejudice and discrimination adversely affect mental health. And it's not all that racism is about, but it absolutely has an impact. Psychiatric scales were not developed with different cultures in mind. And so the psychiatric scales that we use today were made for dominant groups. And so they might miss experiences that are unique to subordinate groups. And so the ways that, racism impacts mental health, well, we're using scales that were only developed with white people in mind, with the general American public in mind. And if we want to know about racial differences, we're probably going to have to alter those scales to take the impacts of microaggressions and inequality into account. And so racial discrimination could be a really important piece of the life experiences of minority groups that aren't captured by these traditional scales. And so in general, we find an inverse relationship between discrimination and mental health. This makes sense. Virtually every study in a 115 study review found that there was this relationship. And what this means is that the more discrimination you face, the worse your mental health is. That makes sense, but it's not accounted for in the dominant scales that most psychiatrists use. Internalized racism that leads to negative self-concepts and self-evaluations can also adversely affect psychological well-being of minorities, which then we see more alcohol consumption, more psychological distress, and internalized racism. Coping processes and resources. So psychological variables like self-esteem, social support, perceptions of mastery and control, anger, hostility, hopelessness, helplessness, repression of denial and emotions vary by class and race. After controlling for discrimination and stress, we do see that Black mental health is generally better than white mental health. What we see, and this is where the coping processes and resources comes in, is we find that Blacks tend to be more exposed to adverse risk factors, but whites are more affected. So even though Black people tend to be exposed to these types of discrimination more, white people tend to have a harder time dealing with it when it happens to them. And this is true across all socioeconomic classes. So why do we see this? Well, one, there's differences in adaptation to diversity. So what I mean by that is that people of color have earlier and more frequent exposure to racial adversity. And they become, because of this, maybe they become more accustomed to dealing with stress. And so I'll give an example. Think about being an agoraphobic. So your agoraphobia is you have an intense fear of leaving your house. In a society where you are expected to go outside and work and socialize and exercise, being agoraphobic can be really, really stressful. It goes directly against what you're expected to do as a productive citizen of American society. But imagine, and you go through your life being an agoraphobe, and it's very difficult. But then imagine being an agoraphobe during lockdown, during 2020. Now, everybody's in a panic. Everybody is losing their shit because they have to be in the house. But you, as an agoraphobic, it is business as usual. If anything, you're like, oh man, now you see what it's like. And so the connection that I'm making here is that in the same way that a lot of people with anxiety reported better mental health than people without anxiety during lockdown, because to them, they're used to dealing with what feels like daily crises. For agoraphobes who wanted to stay in the house, well, before lockdown, it was stigmatized. During lockdown, they could deal with it. They could deal with the stress because they were built for it. Or they could deal with that, change because they were built for it. And so whenever I talk about differences in adaptation to adversity, I'm kind of getting at that agoraphobia reference or analogy, that because Black people have kind of been discriminated against throughout their lives racially, that they tend to develop not a tougher skin, I don't want to say that, but they become more accustomed to dealing with stress. They tend to develop coping resources because it's kind of built into the Black experience to navigate discrimination, unfortunately. I will say the expectation that Black people be strong is harmful, and we will talk about that in detail actually next week. Differences in emotional flexibility can facilitate recovery. And then minority members might also have health enhancing cultural resources that shield against mental distress, which could also include like traditional healing. Finally, migration and acculturation. So stressors associated with migration present significant factors for minority groups. Acculturation and mental health is a big field in mental health. If you want to know, or a big field in the sociology of mental health, if you want to know more, let me know. And so what we have then is feelings of isolation from peers. For example, the challenges of economic survival in a new economic system, acquiring a new language, learning new norms. Migration can be incredibly stressful and incredibly, lonely. And having high levels of stress with low SES and low support group and low social integration and relatively small social ties and the inability to fill your roles, the small roles that you have, can be very detrimental for mental health. And so we do see that migration can present risk factors in itself. We see high rates of PTSD among migrant refugees. Intersectionality is important. So if we think about, migration for Caribbean immigrants, it's gendered in a way that has mental health impacts. And so among Black Caribbean immigrants, men have higher rates of lifetime and past year disorders than men. But remember what we talked about last week. We find that women tend to have higher rates of disorders. But in the Caribbean Black community, men tend to have them. And so whenever we think about migration and acculturation, it's really important to think about intersectionality as well. And then finally, what we see is that there is an inverse relationship between time spent in the US and psychological distress. There are conflicting reports about this, but some studies do allude to this. And so what this means is that as your time in the US increases, psychological distress decreases. So the same stressors that present with migration tend to decrease the longer you're here. So you might feel more connected, more socially integrated, have more support from your environment, feel less isolated, and overall have more opportunities. So moving forward, a question to consider: to what extent is minority status itself a predictor of increased risk of mental health problems? How much is minority stress in itself impacting mental health? And so future research has to really characterize a full range of stress variables for minority populations to identify how they combine with stressors that could be unique to or more prevalent among racial minority populations. Okay, I'll be right back with your lecture on intersectionality and walking you through assignment 4.